You think soul food was born in restaurant kitchens? Think again. These dishes were created in the shadows of plantation life, crafted by enslaved hands from scraps and survival. What began as desperation cooking became American culinary treasure. Here are 60 meals slaves made that became soul food classics. Crab shell chowder was a meal made from what others threw away, the bones and shells left behind once the meat was gone. Along the coast, enslaved cooks learned to coax flavor from the emptiest scraps. Cracked crab shells were boiled with onions, herbs, and a bit of cornmeal or rice, creating a savory broth that smelled like the sea. Sometimes a single claw or a sliver of meat might find its way in, but most of the time, it was just shells and salt water transformed into sustenance. The broth was cloudy and briny, but it was warm and filling, enough to stretch for a family. The steam rose from the pot, rich and salty, curling into the air like a whisper of comfort. The shells gave their last bit of flavor to the pot, a final offering before being discarded again. What was once refuse became nourishment through skill and patience. It was the art of survival turned into cuisine, a testament to how deeply people could draw life from what remained after everything else had been taken. In those bowls of crab shell chowder lived resilience, proof that even emptiness could be turned into sustenance when guided by knowledge, hope, and the will to survive. Brown sugar pound cake was the humble cousin of fancier Christmas cakes, yet it held its own on African American holiday tables with deep caramel flavor and incredible density. Unlike white sugar pound cakes, this version used dark brown sugar that gave the crumb a molasses-tinged sweetness and golden brown color. The recipe followed the traditional pound cake ratio, a pound each of butter, sugar, eggs, and flour, but the brown sugar transformed everything. Black families baked these in tube pans, letting them cool completely before turning out cakes that were heavy enough to anchor a dessert table. Some added pecans or a brown sugar glaze, but many served the cake plain, its flavor rich enough to stand alone. The cake sliced beautifully days after baking, making it ideal for Christmas week when company came and went. Brown sugar pound cake was proof that simplicity could be just as celebratory as complexity when the ingredients spoke for themselves.
Collard green stew was more substantial than the traditional pot of greens, with potatoes and meat added to create a complete meal in one pot. The greens were washed carefully to remove grit, then chopped and simmered with smoked turkey necks or ham hocks until tender. Potatoes were added partway through cooking, absorbing that smoky, slightly bitter broth until they became creamy and flavorful. Onions and garlic rounded out the pot, while vinegar or hot sauce added brightness at the table. This stew was winter medicine in many households, believed to ward off colds and provide strength during dark months. The potlikker was treasured, sipped from cups or soaked up with cornbread. Children learned to love greens through this stew, the potatoes and meat-making vegetables approachable. Peanut stew was a dish with direct African roots, brought across the Atlantic in memories of enslaved people who recreated homeland cooking with American ingredients. Peanuts, called ground nuts or goobers, grew easily in southern soil and were sometimes permitted in small garden plots. The nuts were roasted, shelled, and ground into paste, forming the base of thick, satisfying stew. Root vegetables, greens, and whatever meat scraps were available joined the pot, simmering until everything melded into rich, nutty warmth. The flavor was unlike anything in European cooking, earthy and complex with creamy texture coating the tongue. At Christmas, peanut stew might include extra ingredients or be prepared with special care. The dish represented cultural survival, proof that enslaved people maintained connections to African foodways despite every attempt to erase their heritage. Each bowl contained not just nourishment, but memory and quiet resistance.
Sheep sorrel soup brought a welcome spark of bright flavor after months of heavy grains and salted meat scraps. This common wild plant, with its arrow-shaped leaves and natural lemony tang, grew freely in meadows and along woodland edges. Enslaved gatherers picked the young leaves early in spring, rinsed them well, and simmered them with water and a handful of onions or garlic if available. The result was a light, refreshing broth rich in vitamin C and a gentle tartness that awakened tired palates. African culinary traditions often prized sour greens, and this soup reflected that taste while also serving an important nutritional role in preventing scurvy. After emancipation, sheep sorrel remained a favorite wild green in many rural communities, used in teas and simple soups that celebrated the arrival of warmer weather. Today, foragers still seek it for its tangy bite and health benefits. Sheep sorrel soup stands as a quiet example of how careful observation of the land turned common weeds into an enduring part of Southern culinary heritage. Wild onion and garlic mix was both food and medicine, gathered by those who knew the land as well as any healer. In damp meadows and riverbanks, the green shoots sprouted freely, filling baskets with flavor when rations tasted dull or stale. Boiled into soups or pounded into paste, the bulbs masked bitterness and helped fight colds or fever. Their strong scent filled the air, signaling nourishment in a place where it was often scarce. The people who gathered them worked quietly at dawn, plucking the roots from the earth, grateful for the sharp fragrance that promised vitality. When boiled with beans or greens, these humble plants gave meals depth and warmth, reminding people of home, of something green and alive. Mixing wild onion and garlic with beans or greens brought a comfort that was small but deeply human, the warmth of a familiar taste. These foraged bulbs were proof that knowledge was power, and survival often depended on remembering the wisdom that nature whispered to those willing to listen. In every bowl, seasoned this way, lived both healing and defiance, the flavor of life persisting despite deprivation, a small spark of dignity and strength hidden in every spoonful. Chess pie was the mysteriously named Christmas dessert that African-American families baked when simplicity and sweetness were all that mattered. The filling contained nothing more than eggs, sugar, butter, and a splash of vinegar or buttermilk that gave it a slight tang beneath all that sweetness. Some added cornmeal for texture, creating a thin crust on top as the pie baked. The name's origin remains debated. Some say it came from chest pie because it kept well without refrigeration. Others claim it was just pie, spoken with a southern accent. Black families made chess pie because the ingredients were always on hand and the result never disappointed. The filling baked into a golden custard with a slightly caramelized top that crackled when sliced. Served in thin wedges because of its intense sweetness, chess pie was often the last dessert remaining on holiday tables because everyone assumed someone else had claimed it. This pie was proof that the simplest recipes often endured the longest.
Kidney bean stew was a thick, satisfying pot of comfort that required little more than dried beans, seasoning, and patience. The beans were soaked overnight, then simmered with onions, garlic, tomatoes, and whatever smoked meat the family had, often a ham bone or salt pork. The result was a rich, brick red stew that clung to rice and soaked into cornbread beautifully. Some cooks added bell peppers and celery, creating something close to simplified red beans and rice. This stew was a Monday tradition in many households, made while laundry was done. Children came home from school to find it bubbling on the stove, its aroma promising warmth. The beans provided protein that stretched across several meals, and the broth was considered almost as valuable as the beans themselves. Fried fatback was pure rendered pork fat, sliced thick and fried until edges turned crispy while the center stayed soft and rich. Fatback came from the hog's back, almost entirely fat with thin meat streaks. Slaveholders distributed it as rations because it was cheap and calorie-dense, fueling hard labor. At Christmas, families might fry extra slices or prepare them with more care. The aroma of fatback sizzling in cast iron filled cabins with a smell that meant something good was coming. Eaten on cornbread or alongside greens, Fatback provided essential calories, keeping bodies warm through cold nights. Children fought over crispy edges, while adults took fattier portions. The dish was simple to the point of primitive, yet it kept enslaved people alive. Fatback represented both the cruelty of a system providing only the cheapest foods and the resilience of people who made those scraps sustaining.
Hickory nut milk delivered rich nutrition from the forests when dairy was limited or unavailable. Hickory nuts were cracked and pounded into a fragrant paste, then steeped in hot water and strained to produce a creamy liquid full of natural oils and protein. This drink could be enjoyed warm as a morning beverage or used to enrich cornbread and porridges, offering sustenance without reliance on cow's milk. The technique drew directly from indigenous American practices, which African cooks learned and adapted to their own needs. Hickory trees were plentiful across the Southeast, ensuring a steady supply for those willing to gather and crack the tough shells. Even after emancipation, rural families continued making hickory milk for special dishes, and some Appalachian recipes still call for it today. Its smooth flavor and nourishing qualities illustrate how African American cooks combined local knowledge and Old World methods to create foods of lasting value. Hickory nut milk stands as a quiet but powerful symbol of ingenuity, linking the forest's bounty to a tradition of resilience and culinary skill. Brine-preserved greens were an ingenious way to hold on to summer's bounty long after the fields went bare. Collards, mustard greens, and turnip tops were packed into wooden barrels filled with salt water, weighed down with stones, and sealed tight. Over weeks, the leaves softened and fermented slightly, taking on a tangy flavor that woke up the dullest winter meal. They could be rinsed and cooked with lard, onions, or whatever scraps were available. This simple method kept vitamins alive in seasons when fresh food was impossible to find. The scent that rose when the barrels were opened was sharp, earthy, and comforting, a taste of summer revived in the dead of winter. In homes that had little, these barrels represented life insurance against hunger. Preparing them required patience and precision, the kind of quiet discipline that survival demanded. The barrels lined cabin corners like silent guards against hunger, waiting patiently until their contents were needed. In every household that relied on them, brined greens became a sign of foresight and care, another way the enslaved turned hardship into nourishment, proof that even time itself could be bent toward survival when guided by wisdom and will.
Chicken foot stew might raise eyebrows today, but in black kitchens of the 1970s, it was beloved comfort food made from parts others threw away. The feet were scrubbed clean, blanched to remove the outer skin, then simmered until they released natural gelatin into the broth. This created body and richness that regular chicken pieces could not achieve. Potatoes, carrots, and onions joined the pot, soaking up that deeply savory liquid. Some cooks added hot peppers for warmth that went beyond temperature. The stew was valued during winter illnesses when families believed its collagen-rich broth could heal what ailed you. Children sometimes balked at the appearance, but one taste usually converted them. The feet were free or nearly so, making this stew an act of pure kitchen wisdom, taking what was dismissed and creating nourishment. Possum and sweet potatoes was one of the rare Christmas dishes enslaved families could call their own, made from animals trapped in December woods. The possum was cleaned, soaked overnight in salted water, then roasted slowly with sweet potatoes tucked around the edges. The meat turned tender and slightly sweet from the animal's diet of persimmons, while the potatoes absorbed rich drippings until caramelized. This dish appeared at Christmas because it was one of the few times enslaved people had permission to hunt without supervision. Sweet potatoes came from small garden plots tended after required labor was finished. Possum hunting became a Christmas Eve tradition, with fathers and sons heading into woods with torches and dogs. The dish represented both the pain of bondage and the resilience of people who created celebration from the margins, turning wild game into a feast that carried memory, hope, and quiet defiance against a system designed to strip away every dignity.
Persimmon seed coffee emerged when imported beans were rare or too costly for enslaved communities. Wild persimmons dropped their fruit in autumn, and the hard seeds inside were washed, dried, and roasted until dark and fragrant. Ground and steeped in hot water, they produced a warm, nutty beverage with no caffeine but plenty of comfort on cold mornings. This practice carried forward after the Civil War, especially during wartime shortages when coffee imports faltered again. Families across the South roasted persimmon seeds alongside chicory or other local substitutes, proving the durability of this inventive method. The gentle flavor and toasty aroma made it a beloved alternative long after necessity faded. Today, a few heritage festivals still brew persimmon seed coffee to honor the ingenuity of those who first discovered its rich taste. The drink reminds us that creativity in the face of scarcity can yield traditions that outlast the circumstances that gave birth to them, turning survival into a legacy of flavor and resilience. Wild honeycomb keep was as close as survival ever came to sweetness. Finding a hive in the woods was an act of luck and courage. Collecting it required smoke, patience, and hands willing to risk pain. The honeycomb was wrapped in leaves or sealed in clay jars to preserve it for months. A single spoonful could flavor cornmeal, soothe a sore throat, or serve as a child's rare treat. Honey was a healer, a reward, a reminder that even in hardship, nature offered grace. It gleamed golden in dim light, sticky and fragrant, its taste pure as sunlight. For those who endured scarcity, it was a miracle worth protecting. A jar of wild honey was more than food. It was life itself, captured and kept safe for the days when sweetness felt far away. Caramel cake was the crown of African-American Christmas tables, a dessert so revered that only the most skilled baker in the family dared attempt it. The cake layers were simple: butter, sugar, eggs, flour, and buttermilk. But the caramel icing was where reputations were made or broken. Real caramel icing required cooking sugar until it turned amber, then carefully adding butter and cream while stirring constantly to prevent burning or seizing. The process could take an hour of standing over a hot stove, watching the mixture transform from grainy to glossy. If the caramel was pulled too soon, it would slide off the cake, too late, and it would harden into candy before spreading. Black grandmothers knew the exact color, the perfect drip from the spoon, the moment when everything came together. The finished cake wore thick waves of mahogany icing that cracked slightly when sliced. Caramel cake was Christmas morning, Christmas dinner, and Boxing Day breakfast combined into one magnificent dessert.
Black-eyed pea stew carried cultural significance beyond its role as winter fare. It was luck food, traditionally eaten on New Year's Day, but enjoyed through cold months. The peas were simmered with smoked meat, usually ham hocks or salt pork, until they became creamy and the broth turned rich with smoky depth. Onions, garlic, and tomatoes joined the pot, adding layers of flavor that made each spoonful interesting. Some cooks added collard greens directly to the stew, creating a complete meal that symbolized prosperity. The peas provided protein and fiber, while smoked meat added fat and flavor that satisfied deep hunger. Children ate this stew, knowing the stories behind it, that peas represented coins and greens represented paper money. This was tradition passed down through generations, connecting families to heritage through every bowl. Molasses cake was the closest thing to dessert most enslaved people would taste at Christmas, baked in cast iron skillets over cabin fires. Molasses was the cheapest sweetener, the dark byproduct of sugar refining that plantation owners considered beneath their tables but distributed to quarters. Mixed with cornmeal or rare wheat flour, eggs when available, and gathered spices, the batter baked into dense, moist cake with deep, almost burnt sweetness. The flavor was intense, far removed from delicate cakes served in the big house, but beloved in its own way. Women who made exceptional molasses cake earned reputations spreading across plantations. their recipes guarded and whispered. Children hovered near the fire, watching for signs the cake was ready. Each slice represented weeks of careful hoarding, extra molasses saved, flour hidden away, eggs collected one by one until enough existed to create something truly celebratory from almost nothing.
Smoked catfish tails reveal the skill and resourcefulness that define survival cooking on plantations near rivers and coastal waters. After commercial fishermen or estate kitchens took the prime fillets, the bony tails and smaller pieces were often left behind. Enslaved cooks cleaned these scraps carefully, rubbed them with salt or local spices, and smoked them over slow hickory fires. The result was a flavorful preserved fish that kept for days and could be stirred into stews, crumbled over grains, or eaten on its own with cornbread. Smoking techniques reflected West African traditions carried across the Atlantic, where preserving fish with wood smoke had long been a way to ensure protein during lean seasons. In later years, African American fish camps and southern smokehouses continued this method, turning a food of necessity into a celebrated regional specialty. Modern smoked catfish dishes found in Mississippi and Louisiana restaurants still trace their flavor back to these early practices of careful preservation and culinary creativity born from scarcity. Cattail shoots were a food of hunger seasons, gathered from marshy ponds and swamps when the crops ran out. The young shoots, pale and tender near the base, could be eaten raw or boiled, tasting faintly of cucumber and corn. They grew where others saw only weeds, a secret supply of nourishment hidden in plain sight. Harvesting them meant wading into mud and cold water, cutting each stalk by hand. Cooked with salt or mixed into cornmeal cakes, they offered fiber, minerals, and hope. The cattail was generous. It provided roots for flour, leaves for weaving, and shoots for eating. Its abundance made it a silent ally to those who had little else. In the face of hunger, these swamp plants became a lifeline, a reminder that survival often grows quietly at the edge of hardship. Tea cakes were the simple sugar cookies that African American grandmothers baked by the dozens for Christmas, filling tins that would last through the holidays. These weren't fancy decorated cookies. They were soft, round, lightly sweetened with just a hint of nutmeg or vanilla, and perfect for dunking in coffee or milk. The dough came together quickly with butter, sugar, eggs, and flour, rolled and cut with drinking glasses when cookie cutters weren't available. Black families made tea cakes because they were economical, stretching basic pantry staples into enough cookies for everyone who visited during the season. Children would help cut and bake, learning kitchen skills while sneaking warm cookies when grandma's back was turned. The cookies were packed into tins between layers of wax paper, given as gifts to neighbors and church members. Tea cakes represented hospitality and generosity, the understanding that Christmas meant sharing whatever you had with others.
Beef hot stew was not for the squeamish, but those who grew up eating it remember the rich, almost beefy flavor that no other cut could match. The heart was trimmed of fat and tough valves, then cubed and browned before being covered with liquid and left to simmer. The meat was dense and lean, requiring long cooking to become tender, but the result was deeply satisfying. Onions, carrots, potatoes, and tomatoes stretched the stew while adding sweetness and color. Some cooks added Worcestershire sauce for depth, while others let the meat speak for itself. This stew appeared on tables when money was especially tight, organ meats costing far less than regular cuts. Children learned not to ask what was in the pot, just to eat what was served with gratitude. Sweet potato biscuits were a Christmas treat, stretching precious wheat flour by combining it with mashed sweet potatoes from garden plots. Regular biscuits required flour slaveholders, rarely distributed generously, but sweet potatoes could bulk up dough while adding sweetness and moisture. Potatoes were roasted until soft, mashed smooth, then worked into flour with a bit of lard until soft dough formed. Baked near fire or in Dutch ovens, biscuits came out golden and tender with an orange tint. They were slightly sweet even without molasses, making them feel special compared to everyday cornbread. At Christmas, mothers might save flour for weeks, hiding it from children who would have eaten it as paste. The biscuits represented ingenuity, knowledge that ingredients could be combined into something greater than their parts. Each bite contained the care and planning of enslaved women determined to give their families something beautiful.
Pokeweed greens offered one of the first fresh tastes of spring for people living with few supplies after a long winter. Young pokeweed shoots emerged early and plentifully, but they carried natural toxins that required careful boiling in several changes of water. Enslaved cooks, drawing on African knowledge of wild plants, mastered this technique to create a tender, spinach-like dish that supplied vital vitamins when gardens were only beginning to grow. Seasoned with a bit of salt pork or a sprinkle of wild herbs, poke greens became a welcome sign of the changing season. Long after emancipation, poke salad festivals in Appalachia and the Deep South celebrated this once humble plant, turning a survival ingredient into a community tradition. The careful preparation taught by generations of African American cooks is still followed today, preserving both safety and flavor. Pokeweed greens remind us that deep botanical knowledge and patient cooking transformed a potentially dangerous weed into nourishing food that helped sustain families through the hardest times. Cypress root brew was medicine born from necessity and wisdom. When doctors and remedies were out of reach, the roots of the cypress tree became healer and hope. Boiled into a dark, fragrant tea, it was used to ease fever, pain, and swelling, its scent filling cabins with earthy calm. The recipe came from shared knowledge, African herbal practice intertwined with indigenous tradition. It was strong, almost bitter, but it worked, and that was enough. Making it meant turning to the land, trusting it to restore what cruelty and exhaustion had taken away. Every cup was a quiet act of care in a world built on deprivation. It did not cure everything, but it reminded those who drank it that healing could still exist where freedom did not.
Split pea and ham stew was thick enough to stand a spoon in, made from dried peas that dissolved during cooking into a creamy, satisfying base. The ham bone from Sunday dinner was the foundation, simmered until every bit of flavor had been extracted into the broth. Split peas were added and cooked until they fell apart completely, creating natural thickness without flour or cream. Carrots, celery, and onions provided sweetness and texture, while bay leaves and thyme added depth. This stew was often made midweek when the ham was gone, but the bone remained, proving nothing went to waste in a resourceful kitchen. The color was distinctive, army green, but the flavor was anything but bland. Children grew up eating this stew with crusty bread, learning that leftovers could become something entirely new. Sweet potato pone was a Christmas dessert requiring nothing more than sweet potatoes, molasses, and knowledge passed from mother to daughter across generations. Potatoes were roasted until soft, mashed with molasses, a little lard, and spices like ginger when available. The mixture was pressed into a pan and baked slowly until set into dense, sweet cake that could be sliced and eaten cold over several days. The texture fell somewhere between pudding and candy, smooth and sticky with concentrated sweetness, making children's eyes go wide. Sweet potatoes grew well in small plots. Enslaved families were sometimes permitted to tend, making them one of the few ingredients people could control. The pone represented agency, a dish made entirely from ingredients grown and prepared by enslaved hands without slaveholder involvement. Families made extra pones to share with neighbors, spreading Christmas joy through food when no other gifts were possible.
Roasted gourd seeds turned the remnants of pumpkins and native gourds into a vital source of fat and minerals. After the flesh was cooked for soups or pies, seeds were washed, lightly salted, and spread near the hearth to dry before roasting. This simple preparation produced a crunchy, nutrient-rich snack that stored well through the winter, and could be ground into meal or used to thicken stews. Similar seed roasting traditions existed across West Africa, where pumpkin and melon seeds were prized for both flavor and nutrition, and those techniques crossed the Atlantic with enslaved people. Over time, roasted pumpkin seeds became a familiar autumn treat in American households, sold at fairs and enjoyed during harvest celebrations. The practice illustrates how African culinary memory merged with indigenous crops, creating a food that moved from necessity to seasonal pleasure. Roasted gourd seeds continue to appear in modern kitchens and farmers markets, carrying with them the history of careful saving and the resourceful spirit that turned every part of the plant into nourishment. Smoked pumpkin seeds were the quiet miracle of the harvest. Nothing wasted, everything used. After pumpkins were cooked or dried, the seeds were cleaned, salted, and roasted slowly over smoldering coals. Sometimes they were left in the smokehouse overnight, gathering a deep flavor that kept pests away and preserved them for weeks. The seeds were packed in small cloth bags, tucked into pockets for long days in the fields. Rich in oil and protein, they offered strength when meals were light and days were long. The faint smokiness reminded people of autumn fires, of the scent of the earth preparing for rest. They were eaten during pauses between labor, one seed at a time, a tiny comfort against hunger. Mothers handed them to children during chores, teaching them to save what others might throw away. What began as leftovers became sustenance, a reminder that survival was not about abundance, but awareness. Every seed represented the wisdom of thrift, the art of finding nourishment in what others overlooked. In that small handful of smoke and salt was the story of endurance itself, a quiet testament to how even the smallest things could sustain the human spirit. Fresh coconut cake was the crown jewel of African American Christmas tables, a labor of love that began with cracking open whole coconuts by hand. This wasn't the shredded coconut from bags. This was fresh white meat, grated into fluffy piles that smelled like tropical paradise in December. Black families would purchase coconuts weeks ahead, checking them for freshness by shaking to hear the water inside. The cake itself was a towering white layer cake, but the magic happened in the frosting, a 7-minute icing that required constant beating over boiling water until it formed glossy peaks. Fresh coconut was folded into the frosting and pressed onto every surface until the cake looked caught in a snowstorm. Children would fight over who got to drink the coconut water and eat the leftover shreds. This cake demanded hours of work, but delivered pure Christmas magic. Fresh coconut cake proved that the best celebrations came from effort, not shortcuts.
Turkey wing stew appeared on tables in winter, especially after holidays when turkey parts went on sale. The wings were large enough to provide substantial meat while remaining affordable for families watching every dollar. They were browned in a heavy pot until the skin crisped, then covered with water and simmered with onions, celery, carrots, and potatoes. The dark meat stayed moist through long cooking, becoming tender enough to fall from the bone. Bay, leaves, and thyme added depth without cost, and some cooks stirred in tomato paste for color. This stew fed families for days, the broth growing more flavorful with each reheating. Children loved pulling the meat from bones themselves, making dinner feel interactive. Turkey wing stew represented smart shopping and smarter cooking, turning sale items into meals that felt abundant. Hog jowl and black-eyed peas carried deep meaning for enslaved communities, especially during Christmas when slaveholders sometimes distributed extra pork rations. The jowl was fatty cheek meat, considered undesirable by wealthy families, but treasured in quarters for its rich flavor and ability to season large pots. Black-eyed peas simmered slowly with the jowl until creamy and infused with smoky, salty essence. This combination became associated with luck and prosperity, beliefs enslaved people held fiercely despite their circumstances. One hog jowl could flavor enough peas to feed an entire cabin, stretching limited rations further than seemed possible. Women woke before dawn on Christmas morning to start the pot, knowing it needed hours to reach perfection. The peas were easy to grow and store, making them a reliable staple. This dish was more than sustenance. It was an act of hope, a belief that better days might come despite all evidence to the contrary.
Watermelon rind stew reflects the creativity and endurance of people forced to survive on the edges of the plantation food system. The sweet red fruit was usually reserved for those in the owner's household, but the pale green rind, often thrown away, became a valuable ingredient for the enslaved cooks who transformed scraps into nourishment. Strips of rind were simmered slowly with onions, garden herbs, and whatever seasoning could be gathered or traded, creating a mellow broth rich in minerals and gentle sweetness. This practice traveled forward in time, inspiring the pickled watermelon rind that remains a hallmark of Southern home kitchens today. The dish is more than a recipe. It is a record of resilience, showing how African culinary knowledge turned waste into sustenance and flavor. In modern celebrations of African American foodways, watermelon rind pickles and stews continue to honor those who preserved health and dignity through skilled cooking even when denied basic freedom. Chinquapin nut meal was a secret storehouse of strength, hidden in plain sight among the trees. The chinquapin, a cousin of the chestnut, produced small, sweet nuts that could be gathered in the fall and ground into a fine meal. Enslaved families crushed them using stones, drying the powder in the sun to keep for months. When flour was impossible to come by, this nut meal became bread, porridge, and thickener all at once. It was light to carry but heavy with sustenance, a survival food that kept bellies full during harsh winters or long journeys. The taste was earthy, buttery, faintly sweet, a reminder that even the smallest things in nature held power. The chinquapin tree itself became a silent ally, standing in the background of survival stories few ever told. Every handful of its meal was a small victory against hunger and hardship.
Smoked turkey, neck stew, became a healthier alternative to pork-based dishes while still delivering the deep, smoky flavor that Black families loved. Turkey necks were cheaper than most cuts and provided rich, dark meat that held up beautifully through hours of simmering. The smoking process had already infused them with flavor, so the stew needed little seasoning beyond onions, garlic, and bay leaves. Collard greens or cabbage were often added, cooking down in that smoky broth until silky and tender. Potatoes stretched the meal while absorbing all that savory liquid. This stew was considered lighter than its pork counterparts, but equally satisfying, perfect for families trying to eat better without abandoning. Comfort food. The broth was treasured almost as much as the meat, ladled over rice or sopped up with cornbread. Persimmon pudding was a Christmas dessert made from fruit growing wild and free, belonging to no one and therefore available to everyone who knew where to look. Persimmons ripened after first frost, their orange flesh turning from mouth-puckeringly astringent to honey-sweet overnight. Enslaved foragers gathered them by the basketful, mashing soft pulp and straining out seeds to create thick puree. Mixed with cornmeal, molasses, and sometimes milk when available, the batter baked into pudding, tasting like autumn concentrated into every spoonful. The flavor was complex, sweet and earthy with hints of cinnamon and dates, unlike anything else in the limited cuisine available. Persimmon pudding represented knowledge of the land that enslaved communities developed, understanding which wild foods were safe and when to harvest them. This was wisdom passed from African ancestors who had forged their own lands, adapted to American forests, and carried forward as resistance against total control.
Wild plum. Chutney offered a burst of tart sweetness when sugar was scarce and fruit trees grew untended along plantation edges. Gatherers picked the small, deeply colored plums at peak ripeness and simmered them slowly with a little honey or molasses when available, along with wild herbs for spice. The result was a tangy preserve that enlivened cornbread, salted meats, or simple porridge, providing vitamins and variety in otherwise plain meals. This method of combining fruit with savory seasonings echoed West African chutneys and relishes, demonstrating a culinary bridge between continents. After freedom, African-American home cooks continued to prize wild plums for jellies and sauces, and many Southern families still make small-batch plum preserves each summer. The enduring appeal of wild plum chutney lies in its ability to turn overlooked fruit into a bright condiment that brightens any table. It stands as a flavorful link between survival cooking and the rich tapestry of modern Southern preserves that celebrate both heritage and the gifts of the wild landscape. Parched corn coffee was the taste of resilience in a cup. When real coffee was beyond reach, enslaved people roasted corn kernels in iron pans until they turned dark brown, then ground them into a coarse powder and steeped it in hot water. The brew was smoky, earthy, and faintly sweet, a humble echo of the luxury drink denied to them. It offered warmth in the early hours before sunrise, when labor began and the cold bit through thin clothes. Parched corn coffee was both necessity and ritual, a way to face the day with something that felt human, dignified, and shared. It was brewed from what the earth gave freely, proof that comfort could still be created from scarcity. In its bitterness was a taste of endurance, and perhaps quiet defiance too. Sock-it-to-me cake was the bunt pan showstopper that graced African-American Christmas tables throughout the 1970s and beyond. This dense, buttery cake featured a ribbon of cinnamon pecan filling swirled through the center, creating a surprise with every slice. The name came from the popular catchphrase on "Laugh-In," but the cake itself was pure Southern comfort. Black families made it for Christmas because the bunt shape looked festive without requiring decorating skills, and the cake stayed moist for days. The batter was enriched with sour cream, giving it a tender crumb that melted on the tongue. A simple glaze of powdered sugar and vanilla drizzled over the top caught in all the decorative ridges of the pan. Children loved discovering the cinnamon swirl hidden inside, while adults appreciated the cake's ability to feed a crowd without fuss. Sock-it-to-me cake represented modern convenience meeting traditional flavor, perfect for busy holiday kitchens.
Cabbage and smoked meat stew was economical brilliance, stretching a single ham hock or smoked neck bone into a meal that filled the whole family. The cabbage was chopped roughly and added to a pot where smoked meat had already been simmering, releasing its salty, smoky essence into the broth. Potatoes often joined partway through, adding substance and absorbing flavor. Onions, garlic, and black pepper were the only seasonings needed. The smoked meat did most of the work. This stew was cold weather food made when temperatures dropped and appetites grew. The cabbage became silky and sweet, nothing like the raw vegetable that went into the pot. Children who claimed to dislike cabbage often asked for seconds. It represented simple cooking alchemy, transforming inexpensive vegetables into something families craved. Potlikker with cornbread was perhaps the most humble Christmas meal, yet it nourished bodies and spirits when nothing else was available. Potlikker was cooking water left after boiling greens, collards, turnips, or whatever could be gathered from winter gardens. This broth contained vitamins and minerals leached during cooking, making it genuinely nutritious despite appearing to be mere vegetable water. Enslaved families sipped warm liquor from cups, using cornbread to soak up every drop. The flavor was earthy and green, slightly bitter, but satisfying on cold December nights when cabin walls let in the wind. On Christmas, potlikker might be richer, made from greens cooked with a bit of fatback if rations allowed. Mothers ensured every child received their share, knowing the liquor would ward off winter sickness. This dish taught an essential lesson that nothing should be wasted, that nourishment existed even in what appeared to be scraps.
Roasted chestnuts carried warmth and nourishment through the cold months when plantation rations were meager and gardens lay dormant. Enslaved families foraged chestnut trees that grew wild in the surrounding woods, gathering the smooth brown nuts and roasting them in hearth ashes or iron skillets until their shells cracked and the sweet flesh softened. The nuts' high energy content and natural sweetness made it an important source of calories and comfort, especially during long winter evenings. Roasted chestnuts became part of a wider African American food tradition, appearing in holiday celebrations and roadside markets after emancipation. Their gentle flavor paired well with cornmeal breads and simple stews, and many families passed down techniques for roasting and storing them long after the plantation era ended. Today, roasted chestnuts sold at winter festivals and city street corners carry echoes of that history, reminding us that what began as a survival practice also nurtured community and seasonal ritual for generations who transformed hardship into enduring culture. Honey locust pod syrup was one of those rare touches of sweetness that seemed like a miracle when sugar was nothing but a memory. The long brown pods of the honey locust tree were gathered carefully, cracked open, and boiled for hours in iron pots until the liquid turned dark and fragrant. Its taste was faintly like molasses, with notes of smoke and earth, thin but deeply satisfying. It took patience and firewood, two things never easy to spare, but the result brought joy to meals that might otherwise have been plain or bitter. A spoonful in corn porridge or drizzled over ash cakes could make a hard day's labor feel a little less harsh. The syrup's scent filled cabins with warmth, reminding families of better seasons. The pod itself, once discarded by others, became a small miracle of sweetness pulled straight from the land. For the enslaved, sweetness was not just flavor. It was hope, condensed into something they could hold, share, and remember. In every drop of syrup, there was a quiet act of defiance, a way to create comfort when comfort was denied, proof that ingenuity could still make life taste sweet. Pralines were the Christmas candy that connected African American families to New Orleans traditions, a creamy pecan confection that spread through Black communities across the South. Made from brown sugar, butter, cream, and whole pecans, pralines required careful attention to temperature and timing to achieve their signature texture, creamy yet firm, sweet yet deeply caramelized. Black families made pralines in large batches during weeks before Christmas, storing them in tins for gift-giving and visitors. The process was social, with women gathering in kitchens to stir, test, and drop the candy onto buttered marble or wax paper. Children learned to judge readiness by the way the mixture fell from a spoon, forming soft mounds that set into perfect circles. Each family had their own ratio of pecans to sugar, some preferring more nuts, others favoring creamier candy. Pralines were given to teachers, mail carriers, and church members as tokens. This candy carried culture and community in every bite.
Lima bean and ham stew was a thick, creamy bowl of comfort that stretched a small amount of meat into a meal for the whole family. Dried lima beans were soaked overnight, then simmered with chunks of leftover ham or a ham bone until everything melded into something greater than its parts. The beans broke down slightly during cooking, naturally thickening the broth into a consistency almost like gravy. Onions, garlic, and black pepper provided seasoning, while celery and carrots added sweetness and color. Some families mashed a portion of the beans against the pot to make things heartier. This stew was weeknight fare, simple to prepare but deeply satisfying when served over rice or with cornbread. The ham flavor permeated every bite, making even the plainest bean taste special. Chitlins with hot pepper vinegar was a Christmas dish requiring days of preparation and representing the ultimate example of making treasure from what others discarded. Chitlins, cleaned hog intestines, were given to enslaved workers after butchering because white families refused them. The cleaning process was intensive, requiring multiple soakings in cold water. Once cleaned, chitlins boiled for hours until tender, then served with vinegar spiked with hot peppers that cut through the richness. The powerful, distinctive smell filled quarters with an aroma announcing the holiday. Preparing chitlins was communal, with women gathering to clean and cook while sharing stories and songs. The dish carried African roots, connecting enslaved people to food ways their ancestors practiced before the Middle Passage. Eating chitlins at Christmas became an act of cultural preservation, a way of maintaining identity and community bonds that slavery sought to destroy.
Cane top syrup began with the earliest shoots of sugarcane, long before the full harvest. When planters reserved the mature stalks for commercial sugar, enslaved workers cut the tender tops and simmered them slowly, extracting a thin but sweet syrup. This homemade sweetener flavored cornbread, porridge, and hot drinks, adding a rare touch of luxury to daily meals. The technique reflected both African experience with cane and Caribbean methods of small-batch syrup making. After emancipation, many rural families continued to boil cane juice into syrup during the early season, a practice still alive in parts of Louisiana and Florida. The flavor is lighter and grassier than late-season molasses, making it unique among Southern sweeteners. Cane top syrup shows how skilled hands transformed what might have been discarded into something valuable, blending cultural knowledge with the natural rhythms of the crop. It stands as a reminder that, even in conditions of deprivation, African American cooks created enduring regional flavors that remain treasured in Southern pantries today. Sun-baked clay pot beans were born from ingenuity and necessity, slow-cooked by the earth itself when firewood was scarce or forbidden. Beans were soaked overnight, sealed in clay pots with water, herbs, and bits of fat if they were lucky enough to have some. The pots were buried shallow in sun-warmed soil or left near smoldering embers to cook slowly through the day. The result was tender, smoky beans that carried the flavor of the land and the resilience of those who made them. Cooking this way saved precious wood and kept smoke from betraying their fires. It was quiet cooking, careful cooking, born from both wisdom and the need to survive unseen. When the pots were unearthed at dusk, the beans were hearty enough to feed several people, filling the belly and steadying the heart. In a world built on taking, this was a small act of keeping, of making something nourishing from the warmth of the ground itself. Molasses taffy was Christmas entertainment disguised as candy, a sticky-pulled confection that turned entire African-American families into taffy-pulling teams on cold December evenings. The process began with boiling molasses, sugar, and butter until it reached the hardball stage, then pouring the hot mixture onto buttered platters to cool. Once it could be handled, the real fun began. Everyone would butter their hands and start pulling, stretching the dark mass until it lightened in color and developed that signature chewy texture. Children loved the mess, the laughter, and the competition to see who could pull the longest strand. The finished taffy was cut into pieces and wrapped in wax paper, stored in jars for the holiday season. This wasn't just candy, it was family bonding, a Christmas Eve tradition that created memories alongside sweets. Molasses taffy represented the old ways of doing things, when entertainment came from working together rather than watching screens.
Beef tripe stew was not for the faint of heart, but those who grew up eating it remember the dish with deep affection. Tripe required thorough cleaning and long cooking to become tender, but the result was worth every minute of preparation. The honeycomb texture held onto flavorful broth, making each bite an experience. Black cooks prepared it with tomatoes, onions, garlic, and plenty of pepper, creating a stew with Caribbean and Southern influences intertwined. Some versions included potatoes or hominy to stretch the meal. The dish was considered special occasion food despite its humble origins, served when the family wanted something different. The smell was distinctive, earthy, and rich, announcing to the neighborhood that serious cooking was happening. Tripe stew taught children that texture and flavor mattered more than appearance. Rabbit stew appeared on Christmas tables when enslaved men managed to trap rabbits in woods surrounding the plantation during scarce personal hours. Rabbits were skinned quickly, cut into pieces and simmered with wild onions and root vegetables saved from fall gardens until meat fell from bone. The stew was thin by necessity, never enough fat to make it rich, but hot and filling, warming bellies on the coldest nights. Rabbit hunting required skill passed from fathers to sons, knowledge of where rabbits ran and how to set snares without detection. The meat was lean and mild, absorbing whatever flavors the cook added while providing precious protein regular rations lacked. Families gathered around the single pot, each person receiving a share ladled into whatever vessel they owned. The stew represented self-reliance and small freedoms enslaved people carved within the brutal system, the ability to provide something extra through their own labor and knowledge.
Wild grape must connected plantation kitchens to the native abundance of the American South. Muscadine and scuppernong grapes grew untended along fences and forest edges, providing a dependable late summer harvest. Enslaved workers gathered the clusters and crushed them by hand to create a tangy juice that could be fermented slightly for a refreshing drink or boiled into a syrupy must used to season grains and greens. This technique echoed West African traditions of using fruit reductions to brighten savory dishes. After emancipation, muscadine wine and homemade grape jellies became hallmarks of Southern foodways, and small farms still produce them today. The careful gathering and slow simmering required patience and skill, qualities that defined the cooking of those who made the most of every wild resource. Wild grape must stand as both a practical recipe and a testament to how African American cooks merged Old World techniques with New World ingredients, leaving a flavor that continues to shape regional preserves and beverages across the Carolinas and Georgia. Sassafras bark seasoning was one of the earliest flavorings used when store-bought spices were out of reach. The roots and bark of the sassafras tree were peeled, dried, and ground into powder, its aroma rich with warmth and spice. Sprinkled over cornmeal or beans, it transformed plain food into something fragrant and satisfying. Beyond taste, sassafras carried medicinal value too. It soothed sore throats, eased stomach pains, and was believed to cleanse the blood. Its use came from a blend of African and native traditions, a shared understanding that flavor could also heal. For those whose daily meals were often bland or repetitive, this bark brought a hint of joy. Even the smallest dash felt like a luxury. When added to boiling pots, the air would fill with its woodsy scent, a moment of beauty amid scarcity. Families guarded small pouches of ground bark like treasure, passing the habit from one generation to the next. In times when dignity was stolen, seasoning food became a quiet way to reclaim it. Sassafras was more than spice. It was spirit made edible, a reminder that even the simplest flavor could speak of memory, culture, and resilience. Divinity candy was the temperamental diva of African American Christmas confections, a fluffy white candy that would only cooperate on dry winter days. Made from sugar, corn syrup, and egg whites beaten until impossibly light, Divinity required perfect conditions to achieve its cloud-like texture. Black families learned to check the weather before attempting a batch. Too much humidity and the candy would never set, remaining a sticky mess. When it worked, Divinity was pure magic, melting on the tongue with intense sweetness and a slight chew. Pecans or walnuts were often folded in for crunch, turning simple candy into something worth saving for company. Women would drop spoonfuls onto wax paper, working quickly before the mixture stiffened. Divinity was passed around in tins at church gatherings and packed into Christmas gift boxes for neighbors. This candy was Christmas alchemy, transforming sugar and air into something that seemed to defy kitchen science entirely.
Butterbean stew was creamy comfort in a bowl, made from large lima beans that broke down during cooking into something almost like a thick sauce. The beans were simmered with smoked ham hocks or bacon, their natural starch thickening the broth while pork added depth and richness. Onions and garlic were essential, as were bay leaves that perfumed the entire pot. Some families added tomatoes for color, while others preferred the pure, creamy simplicity of beans and pork. This stew was filling enough to serve as a complete meal, especially paired with cornbread that soaked up every drop of that silky broth. Children often requested seconds, not realizing how little the meal cost to prepare. Butterbean stew represented Southern cooking magic, transforming humble dried beans into something that tasted far richer. Crackling bread was a Christmas treat that transformed hog butchering scraps into something children waited for all year. When slaveholders slaughtered hogs in December, rendered fat left behind crispy bits of skin called cracklings. These golden, crunchy pieces were mixed into cornmeal batter and baked into bread that snapped with each bite. The bread was dense and satisfying, with pockets of salty, porky flavor throughout the golden crumb. Enslaved families considered crackling bread special because cracklings were only available during winter butchering season. Mothers saved the best pieces, hiding them until enough had been collected for a proper batch. The aroma of crackling, bread baking filled small cabins with warmth and anticipation, signaling the holiday had arrived. This simple bread carried enormous emotional weight, a reminder that even within slavery's brutal system, moments of sweetness could be created from scraps others discarded without thought.
Corncob jelly turned what most people threw away into a shimmering golden spread that brightened plain breads and biscuits. After kernels were cut from the cob for other uses, the remaining cores were boiled for a long time to draw out natural starch and pectin. The liquid was strained, sweetened with a modest amount of sugar or honey when available, and cooked again until it thickened into a soft jelly with a delicate corn flavor. Enslaved cooks perfected this transformation, ensuring nothing went to waste and every scrap contributed to nourishment. Long after emancipation, rural homesteaders and Depression-era families embraced corncob jelly as a thrifty delicacy, and it still appears at Southern craft fairs and heritage festivals. The gentle sweetness and faintly toasted aroma offer a taste of memory and ingenuity. Corncob jelly proves that culinary creativity can turn the most humble remnants of the harvest into something beautiful, a spread that honors the perseverance of those who found flavor and comfort in the very parts of the plant others overlooked. Coonie root flour was one of the rarest forms of survival food, pulled from the sandy soils of Florida's coastal woods. The County, or Florida arrowroot, held starch deep within its roots, but it was also toxic until carefully processed. Enslaved people learned to grate the roots, soak them in running water for days, and dry the pulp into a fine powder. The process was laborious and delicate, but the result was precious: a clean, edible flour that could be used in bread, mush, or porridge. It was a carbohydrate reserve for when nothing else remained, sustaining life in times of famine or isolation. Each batch was a victory of knowledge over danger, of patience over hunger. The skill to prepare it safely came from generations of shared wisdom, passed quietly between hands. To turn poison into nourishment was not only survival, it was genius born from necessity.
Pig feet stew was hearty winter fare that transformed an overlooked cut into something families craved when temperatures dropped. The feet were split, cleaned thoroughly, and simmered for hours until the skin became tender and natural gelatin thickened the broth into something luxurious. Onions, garlic, vinegar, and crushed red pepper created a tangy heat that cut through the richness. Some families added potatoes or beans to stretch the meal. The stew was made in large batches because it kept well and improved after sitting overnight in the refrigerator. The gelatin would set into a jiggly mass that liquefied again when reheated. This dish required patience. Rushing meant tough, chewy results. Children watched mothers and grandmothers tend these pots, learning that good food took time. Pig feet stew proved nothing went to waste. Ash cakes were the most primitive bread available to enslaved families, made by wrapping cornmeal dough in cabbage leaves and burying it directly in hot fireplace ashes. The technique required no pan, just cornmeal mixed with water and salt, shaped into rounds, wrapped in leaves, and nestled into coals. After 20 minutes, cakes emerged with smoky, slightly charred exterior and dense, steaming interior that tasted like survival itself. At Christmas, ash cakes might be made larger or given extra care, but the method remained unchanged. Children learned to make them young. Understanding this skill might mean the difference between eating and hunger. The cabbage leaves imparted faint green flavor and kept ash from penetrating the dough. Ash cakes represented the absolute baseline of cookery, what could be made when nothing else was available, yet they filled bellies and sustained lives through bondage's cruelest seasons.
Pine needle tea offered a bright and restorative drink when fresh produce was scarce during cold months. Enslaved foragers collected the youngest green needles from longleaf and loblolly pines, rinsed them carefully, and steeped them in hot water until the brew released a light citrus aroma. Rich in vitamin C, this tea helped ward off scurvy and brought a welcome freshness to winter diets heavy with salt-preserved foods. The practice echoed both indigenous traditions and West African herbal knowledge, merging two continents' wisdom into a single sustaining cup. Families continued to brew pine needle tea well after emancipation, and it remains popular among modern herbalists for its gentle flavor and reputed immune-boosting qualities. Its evergreen scent and warm golden color remind us that even in the most barren season, the forest offered nourishment. Pine needle tea illustrates how observing the land and respecting its cycles allowed people to find both medicine and comfort, turning what others overlooked into a sustaining daily ritual that strengthened body and spirit alike. Persimmon leather was a sweetness born from scarcity, made when sugar was a dream too far from reach. Wild persimmons, soft and golden when ripe, were gathered by hand and mashed into pulp, their tartness fading into deep honeyed flavor as they dried under the southern sun. Spread thin on boards or cloth, the pulp hardened into chewy sheets that could last for months, folded and stored for the hard winter ahead. It was candy made by patience, nutrition pressed into a form that would not spoil. The process itself was quiet work, often done at the edges of daylight, each batch a small defiance against hunger. When the cold arrived and food was scarce, a strip of persimmon leather could lift spirits and soothe hunger's edge. In its sweetness lived a lesson. Survival does not always mean bitterness. Sometimes it tastes like sunlight caught in fruit. Jam cake was the spiced Christmas cake that turned summer's preserved blackberries into winter celebration across African American households in the South. This dense, moist cake was loaded with homemade blackberry jam, warming spices like cinnamon, cloves, and allspice, plus buttermilk that kept it tender for days. The jam was stirred directly into the batter, giving the cake a deep purple-brown color and concentrated fruit flavor that no fresh berry could match. Black families often saved their best jars of preserves for Christmas jam cake, knowing the cake was only as good as the jam inside. Some versions included raisins, pecans, or a splash of bourbon for extra richness. The cake was typically frosted with caramel icing or left plain, dusted with powdered sugar like Christmas snow. Jam cake connected summer's labor to winter's celebration, proving nothing was wasted in households that preserved the harvest. This cake was heritage in edible form.
Navy bean and bacon stew was comfort food that required nothing more than pantry staples and a little time. The beans were soaked overnight, then simmered with thick-cut bacon, onions, and garlic until everything became tender and the broth turned cloudy with starch. Some families added tomatoes for color, while others preferred the pure white simplicity of beans and pork. Bay leaves and black pepper were the only seasonings needed. The bacon provided salt and smokiness that permeated every bite. This stew was often made in large batches because it kept well and reheated beautifully. children came home from school to find it waiting on the stove, ready to warm them inside out. The beans provided protein that stuck to ribs, while bacon satisfied cravings for richness. Roasted raccoon was a Christmas dish for families skilled enough to trap the clever animals raiding corn cribs after dark. Raccoons were fatty and flavorful, their meat rich from autumn foraging on nuts and berries. The animal was skinned, cleaned, and often parboiled before being roasted slowly with sweet potatoes. The meat turned dark and tender, with distinctive taste falling somewhere between pork and dark poultry. Trapping raccoons required knowledge passed between generations, where they traveled what bait they preferred. At Christmas, a successfully caught raccoon meant protein slaveholders hadn't provided, food earned through skill during precious free hours. Families shared the meat with neighbors, spreading bounty across cabins. The dish represented self-sufficiency and small victories enslaved people won against a system designed to control every aspect of existence, turning cunning and patience into feast.
Bay leaf infusion offered warmth and gentle comfort, using one of the few aromatic plants that grew wild near plantation quarters. Fresh or dried bay leaves were gathered from native bay trees and steeped in hot water to create a soothing tea with a light floral scent and mild medicinal qualities. This infusion was believed to aid digestion and ease colds, and it provided a calming moment during hard days. The knowledge of bay's healing properties came from both African herbal traditions and local indigenous practices, merging into a shared understanding of the land's quiet gifts. Even after emancipation, African American communities continued to brew bay tea for health and hospitality, and its subtle fragrance remains a hallmark of Southern kitchens where bay leaves still flavor soups and stews. Bay leaf infusion stands as a gentle reminder that survival was not only about calories but also about care, showing how enslaved people drew strength and solace from the natural world around them. Frog leg broth was not a delicacy then, but a resource found in the wetlands where hunger met opportunity. In low country swamps and riverbanks, frogs were plentiful and easy to catch at night with torches or bare hands. Their legs, though small, were rich in protein, and their bones gave flavor to broths thickened with roots or cornmeal. It was a meal of the marsh, humble but sustaining. Boiled with wild onions or herbs, it produced a light, savory soup that soothed empty stomachs and eased fatigue. Children were often the ones sent to catch frogs, turning play into survival work. It was food that required courage and cleverness in equal measure, proof that life could be drawn from even the smallest, quietest corners of the natural world. Frog leg broth may not have been glamorous, but it was a meal that kept people strong enough to see another day. Egg custard pie was the delicate Christmas dessert that African American families made when they wanted something lighter than the rich cakes dominating holiday tables. The filling was simple: eggs, sugar, milk, vanilla, and a whisper of nutmeg, baked in a flaky crust until the custard set with a gentle wobble in the center. The top developed a golden skin dusted with nutmeg that looked like Christmas itself. Black families valued this pie because eggs were often available from backyard chickens, making it affordable even in lean years. The texture was silky and cool, a welcome contrast to heavy holiday meals. Children loved its gentle sweetness, and elders appreciated its digestibility after days of rich food. Egg custard pie required patience. Baking too fast would curdle the filling, too slow would make it weep. Grandmothers knew their ovens intimately, adjusting temperatures by feel. This pie was simplicity perfected, proof that Christmas elegance needed nothing more than eggs, cream, and care.
Ham hock and bean stew was a wintertime miracle that transformed dried beans and smoked pork into a meal substantial enough to fuel a family through freezing temperatures. The ham hocks were simmered for hours, their smoky essence infusing the cooking liquid while collagen broke down into silky richness. Navy beans or Great Northerns were added, absorbing every bit of porky flavor as they softened into creamy tenderness. Onions, garlic, and bay leaves rounded out the pot. This stew was Monday food in many households, made when the weekend ham bone still had meat clinging to it. The beans provided protein that rivaled expensive cuts, and the broth was considered medicine for cold and flu season. Families stretched this stew across several days, knowing each reheating only deepened the flavors. Collard greens with ham hocks appeared on Christmas tables as one of the most anticipated dishes of the year, simmered for hours until tough leaves turned silky. Collards grew well in southern winters, their broad leaves sweetening after frost. Enslaved cooks stripped leaves from thick stems, washed them multiple times, then packed them into iron pots with whatever ham hock the slaveholder provided. The greens cooked down dramatically, a bushel reducing to few servings as leaves absorbed smoky pork flavor and released mineral-rich liquor. At Christmas, there might be more meat on the bone than usual, making the dish feel almost luxurious. Families passed down specific techniques: when to add vinegar, how much pepper. The greens were eaten with cornbread for soaking up precious potlikker, ensuring nothing was wasted. This dish represented nourishment, tradition, and small mercies that made survival possible.
Burdock root stew speaks to the deep botanical knowledge carried by African cooks who could read the land for nourishment even when fields were bare. Burdock, a hardy root with a flavor similar to earthy artichoke, grew wild along fence rows and shaded ditches where other crops refused to thrive. Gatherers dug the long tap roots with simple hand tools, scrubbed them clean, and sliced them thin before simmering them for hours with any garden greens or herbs that might be on hand. The slow cooking softened the root into a tender base for a broth that was both filling and rich in minerals. This practice echoed African and indigenous traditions of using wild roots as a staple during lean times. After emancipation, burdock continued to appear in rural foraging guides and folk remedies, admired for its subtle sweetness and sustaining qualities. Today, herbalists still value burdock for its nutrients, reminding us that what once served as a quiet survival food remains a symbol of resourcefulness and a connection to the untamed landscape of the American South. Groundnut stew with foraged snails was a meal that spoke of survival, patience, and deep memory. When meat was impossible to find or too precious to use, people turned to the land itself for sustenance. Wild snails gathered after rain became the answer to hunger, their shells glistening in the damp earth. They were cleaned, boiled, and simmered slowly in a paste made from crushed groundnuts, the peanut having taken firm root in the soil and soul of the South after its long journey from West Africa. The aroma that filled the air was earthy and rich, carrying the same warmth found across generations of kitchens from Sierra Leone to South Carolina. This stew was not only food, it was endurance turned to flavor. Cooking it required time, care, and an understanding that survival meant transforming the simplest of ingredients into comfort. Those who ate it tasted both hardship and ingenuity in every bite. Boiled custard was Christmas in a cup, a silky, drinkable dessert that African American families stirred slowly over low heat until it coated the back of a spoon. Unlike store-bought eggnog, this was made from scratch with eggs, sugar, milk, and vanilla, cooked with patience that couldn't be rushed. The process required constant stirring to prevent curdling, a skill grandmothers passed to daughters while sharing stories. Served chilled in small glasses, boiled custard was rich enough to feel like dessert, but light enough to sip throughout Christmas Day. Some families added a splash of bourbon for the adults, creating a version that warmed from the inside out. Children would beg for just one more glass, their upper lips painted white with creamy sweetness. The custard was often made Christmas Eve, chilling overnight so the flavors could deepen. Boiled custard represented patience and tradition, proof that the best Christmas treats couldn't be rushed or purchased.
Beef shank stew transformed one of the toughest, cheapest cuts into something that rivaled expensive roasts in flavor and tenderness. The shanks were cross-cut to expose the marrow, then browned deeply before being covered with water or stock. Hours of gentle simmering broke down tough connective tissue into gelatin, creating a broth so rich it set solid when chilled. Onions, carrots, celery, and potatoes joined the pot, soaking up that beefy essence. The marrow was considered the prize, spread on bread or stirred into the stew for extra richness. This was Sunday dinner food, started in the morning and ready by evening. Families gathered, knowing the wait had been worth it, each bite tender and deeply satisfying. Beef shank stew proved patience could transform humble cuts into something special. Fried pork skins were a Christmas treat made from the skin of butchered hogs, cut into strips and fried in their own rendered fat until puffed and crispy. The skins started tough and rubbery, but heat transformed them into light, crunchy bites that shattered between teeth. Salt was the only seasoning needed, though some families added a sprinkle of pepper when available. Children gathered around the frying pot, eager to snatch the first pieces as they emerged golden and bubbling from the lard. The skins provided both protein and fat, essential nutrients during cold months when bodies needed extra fuel. At Christmas, there might be more skins available from the holiday butchering, turning what was usually a small treat into something approaching abundance. The crackling sound of frying skins announced the season as clearly as any carol. This dish represented the waste-nothing philosophy that enslaved communities developed. Every piece of the hog had value when survival depended on stretching resources to their absolute limits.
Maypop fruit mash turned the wild passion fruit of the American South into a rare dessert filled with tropical fragrance. Known as maypop for the sound of its hollow fruit when stepped on, this native vine produced aromatic yellow fruits that ripened in late summer. Enslaved foragers gathered the fruit, split the rinds, and scooped the bright pulp into a bowl with a drizzle of molasses or honey when such sweeteners were at hand. The result was a naturally tangy treat that needed no cooking and provided a burst of vitamins. The flavor, a cross between citrus and melon, delighted anyone lucky enough to taste it. Even after emancipation, rural families prized maypops for jellies and pies, and the plant remains a cherished wild edible across the Southeast. Maypop fruit mash preserves a memory of fleeting seasonal abundance and the creativity that transformed wild gifts into moments of celebration, proving that even in the harshest circumstances, people found ways to enjoy the bright, unique flavors offered freely by the natural world. Ash-roasted corn cobs were the original field ration, born from necessity and fire. When cooking pots were unavailable, enslaved people wrapped whole corn cobs in layers of husk and buried them deep in hot ash until the kernels softened and browned. It was a meal that could travel, carried in cloth or pocket, eaten in silence between labor and rest. The faint char of the ash gave the corn a smoky sweetness that lingered long after the last kernel was gone. In fields where hunger pressed hard, this was survival disguised as simplicity. A meal that needed no utensil, no luxury, only heat and patience. Even after freedom came, many still roasted corn this way, a quiet inheritance of resourcefulness. What began as a means of endurance became memory, passed down through taste and the smell of burning husk. Prune cake was the deeply spiced Christmas cake that African-American families made when dried plums were more affordable than fresh fruit. Stewed prunes were folded into a batter, rich with cinnamon, allspice, cloves, and nutmeg, creating a cake so dark and moist it seemed almost magical. The prunes provided natural sweetness and kept the cake tender for over a week, perfect for the marathon of holiday visiting. Black families often frosted prune cake with caramel or brown sugar icing, amplifying the deep flavors already present. Some versions included buttermilk for tang or black walnuts for crunch. The cake was substantial enough to anchor a dessert table, yet refined enough to serve to the preacher when he came calling. Prune cake represented the ingenuity of making celebration from what was available, turning an unfashionable fruit into something genuinely delicious. Those who remember it recall its complex spice and satisfying density with real affection.
Chicken back stew was proof that nothing went to waste in a resourceful kitchen. The backs were often the cheapest parts at the butcher, mostly bone with bits of dark meat clinging to them, but they made some of the richest broth imaginable. The backs were browned first, then covered with water and simmered with onions, celery, carrots, and potatoes until the meat fell away and the broth turned golden. Some cooks added rice or noodles to stretch things further. The flavor was deeply chickeny, more intense than stews made from breast or thigh meat. Children grew up pulling small pieces of tender meat from the bones, learning that patience and attention could transform scraps into something satisfying. Chicken back stew represented the wisdom of generations who understood that flavor lived in the bones. Turnip greens with salt pork was a winter dish, making use of hardy vegetables still available when most gardens had gone dormant. Turnips grew well into cold weather, their leafy tops remaining edible even after frost. Enslaved cooks would harvest the greens, wash them thoroughly, and simmer them for hours with whatever salt pork was available, often just a small piece stretched to flavor a large pot. The greens cooked down into a tender, slightly bitter mass infused with smoky pork essence. The cooking liquid was saved and drunk or sopped up with cornbread, extending the meal's nutrition further. At Christmas, the dish might include both the turnip roots and their greens, the white flesh of the turnip adding substance to the pot. Families grew turnips in their small garden plots because they were reliable and required little attention. This dish represented the knowledge of seasonal cooking that enslaved communities developed, understanding which foods remained available through winter and how to make them sustaining.
Chinquapin nut cakes offered small moments of sweetness created from the rich forests of the American South. The chinquapin, a dwarf chestnut native to the region, produced small, sweet nuts that could be eaten raw or roasted. Enslaved families collected these nuts in autumn, cracked their shells, and ground the meat into a fine meal. Mixed with a little cornmeal, honey, or molasses when available, the nut meal formed small cakes that were baked or cooked on a griddle until golden brown. These cakes carried both nutrition and a sense of celebration, providing rare treats for special gatherings. The flavor, slightly sweeter than a chestnut with a buttery finish, became a cherished memory passed down through generations. Even after emancipation, chinquapin nuts remained a prized wild harvest in Appalachian and southern communities, though the trees have grown scarce in modern times. Chinquapin nut cakes remind us of the connection between forest abundance and human creativity, transforming a foraged ingredient into a dessert that honored both the landscape and the people who carefully tended its secrets. Pickled watermelon rinds were the epitome of making something from nothing, a perfect reflection of the ingenuity that sustained life under impossible circumstances. The sweet pink flesh of the melon was eaten quickly, but the pale rind, normally discarded, was peeled, cut, and boiled in vinegar with cloves and sugar until translucent. Stored in jars, it became crisp, tangy, and refreshing, a treat that lasted long after harvest. It was both preservation and protest, turning scraps into sustenance. This act of saving every part of what little was available revealed a truth. Survival was not only about endurance, but about creativity. These jars lined kitchen shelves like quiet trophies, gleaming reminders that waste was a privilege few could afford. Even now, a single bite of pickled rind carries that legacy, sweet, sharp, and unbroken. Japanese fruitcake had nothing to do with Japan, but everything to do with African American Christmas traditions across the Deep South. This layered spice cake earned its exotic name from the unusual combination of ingredients: coconut, raisins, and warm spices stacked between alternating layers of light and dark cake. Black families made this for Christmas because it showcased skill and patience, with each layer requiring separate preparation. The white layers were tender and light, while the dark layers were dense with spices, nuts, and dried fruit. A thick coconut frosting bound everything together, often made with freshly grated coconut that families cracked by hand. The cake improved over several days, making it perfect for Christmas Eve preparation. Grandmothers guarded their recipes closely, adjusting spice ratios to family preferences. Japanese fruitcake was celebration made edible, a towering statement that Christmas in Black households meant going all out for those you loved most.
Chicken gizzard stew turned an often discarded organ into something families genuinely looked forward to eating. Gizzards were cheap at the butcher counter, sold by the pound for far less than other chicken parts. They required long cooking to become tender, but that time transformed their chewy texture into something almost silky. The gizzards were browned first, then simmered with onions, garlic, tomatoes, and potatoes until everything melded together. Some cooks added carrots or celery, while others kept it simple with salt, pepper, and bay leaves. The gravy that formed was dark and rich, perfect for ladling over rice or biscuits. Children who grew up eating this stew developed a taste for organ meats early. The dish represented kitchen wisdom, knowledge that parts others threw away could become dinner. Hominy grits with red-eye gravy was a Christmas morning dish, transforming humble corn into approaching comfort. Hominy was made by soaking dried corn in lye until hulls loosened, leaving swollen kernels that were dried and ground into grits. The grits cooked slowly until creamy, requiring constant stirring to prevent scorching. Red-eye gravy was made by deglazing the pan after frying ham with strong black coffee, creating thin, intensely flavored sauce. Poured over grits, the gravy added richness, elevating simple corn porridge into something memorable. Enslaved families might only have red-eye gravy at Christmas when coffee was available and meat drippings plentiful. The combination was filling and warming, stretching limited ingredients into a meal that felt celebratory. Grits carried history. The nixtamalization process, creating hominy, came from indigenous peoples who taught it to both enslaved Africans and European settlers alike.
Ground pumpkin seed. Porridge transformed leftover seeds into a hearty meal that supplied both protein and healthy oils. After pumpkins were cooked for pies or stews, the seeds were washed, dried, and pounded into a coarse meal. This meal was simmered slowly in water or thin milk, creating a creamy porridge with a subtle nutty flavor. Sweetened lightly with honey or molasses when available, it became a sustaining breakfast or evening dish that used every part of the harvest. The method reflected West African culinary traditions where ground seeds thickened soups and stews, showing how transplanted knowledge enriched American foodways. Generations after emancipation, pumpkin seed porridge remained a seasonal specialty in some rural areas, appreciated for its nourishing qualities and gentle taste. Modern cooks might recognize it in contemporary seed-based milks and cereals, proving that this centuries-old practice still influences how we eat today. Ground pumpkin seed. Porridge highlights the wisdom of never wasting what nature provides and celebrates a heritage of careful resourcefulness that continues to inspire. Pine bark tea was one of the oldest remedies in the arsenal of survival, brewed from the inner bark of pine trees when other nourishment was gone. The bark was stripped, boiled in water until the liquid turned deep amber, and drunk to fight scurvy, fever, or the chill of endless work. It carried a sharp, resinous flavor, bitter yet strangely comforting to those who knew it well. The tea gave strength when nothing else could, its warmth tracing a line from the forest to the heart. For those denied medicine and rest, this humble brew became both cure and comfort. It was a reminder that the earth itself could provide healing, even when people were deprived of every other resource. Pine bark tea was not just drink, it was proof that knowledge, passed from African and indigenous hands alike, could turn even bark into life. Bourbon balls were the no-bake Christmas treat that let African American families indulge in a little grown-up sweetness during the holidays. These rich confections combined crushed vanilla wafers with cocoa, powdered sugar, corn syrup, and generous splashes of bourbon, rolled into small spheres and coated with more powdered sugar. The bourbon wasn't cooked out, giving each ball a warm, spirited bite that adults savored after Christmas dinner. Black families often made bourbon balls in assembly line fashion, with some crushing cookies, others mixing, and still others rolling and coating. The candies improved over time, mellowing as the bourbon infused every crumb, making them perfect for preparing weeks ahead. They were stored in tins between layers of wax paper, hidden from children too young for the whiskey but drawn to the chocolate coating. Bourbon balls appeared at holiday card parties and New Year's Eve gatherings. This candy was sophisticated yet simple, proving elegance didn't require an oven.
Turnip and salt pork stew was humble cold weather fare that transformed root vegetables into something families craved when winter settled in. The turnips were peeled and cubed, then simmered with chunks of salt pork that had been rendered slowly to release their fat. The pork added saltiness and richness, while the turnips absorbed those flavors and became silky and sweet. Onions and black pepper were the only other seasonings needed. Some families added potatoes to stretch the meal further, while others kept it simple with just turnips and pork. This stew was often made when money was especially tight, turnips being one of the cheapest vegetables available. The broth that formed was thin but deeply flavored, perfect for soaking into cornbread. Children learned through this stew that even modest ingredients could taste like comfort. Dried apple stack cake appeared at Christmas gatherings when families had managed to dry and preserve apples from fall harvests. The cake consisted of thin layers of molasses, sweetened dough, stacked high with spiced dried apple, filling between each layer, making it require planning months ahead, drying apple slices in late summer, storing them carefully through autumn, then reconstituting them with water and spices when December arrived. Each layer was baked separately, requiring patience and careful fire management. The assembled cake needed to rest for days, allowing moisture from the apple filling to soften the dense layers into something tender and unified. Families who brought stacked cakes to Christmas gatherings earned respect for their foresight and skill. The cake represented the long view enslaved people took toward survival, understanding that today's labor could become tomorrow's celebration if done with care and intention. Each slice contained months of planning and hope.
Roasted sassafras roots provided a fragrant tea with a naturally sweet, slightly spicy flavor that refreshed the spirit and offered mild stimulation. Enslaved gatherers carefully dug the young roots of the sassafras tree, washed them, and roasted them over gentle heat to draw out their aromatic oils. When steeped in hot water, the roasted roots released a deep reddish brew with notes of vanilla and citrus. This tea was enjoyed both for its taste and for traditional medicinal uses, reflecting a blend of African and indigenous knowledge about native plants. After emancipation, sassafras tea became a beloved Southern beverage, eventually serving as the base flavor for the first root beers. The practice demonstrates how a simple foraged root shaped a lasting American flavor that extends far beyond its humble beginnings. Roasted sassafras roots show how understanding the forest's offerings allowed communities to create drinks of comfort and cultural significance from ingredients freely given by the land itself. Jerusalem artichoke cash was a clever answer to hunger, hidden right beneath the soil. These knobby roots, also called sunchokes, grew wild and multiplied easily, making them a dependable food when nothing else survived the frost. After harvest, they were buried in cool earth or sand pits near the home, dug up one by one as winter crept in. Raw, they were crisp like water chestnuts. Boiled or roasted, they turned soft and nutty, rich with warmth. Unlike potatoes, they did not spoil quickly, and unlike corn, they required no field. They belonged to those who had the wisdom to look down, not out, to find food where others saw weeds. Families who kept Jerusalem artichokes knew security in the hardest months. Their flavor was mild, comforting, and slightly sweet, a quiet reward for foresight and care. Each tuber unearthed was a small triumph against scarcity, a quiet declaration that they would make it through another season, one root at a time, a reminder that even in cold earth, sustenance could still grow for those who knew where to look. Dark fruitcake was the boozy, dense Christmas cake that African-American families aged for weeks before the holidays, feeding it bourbon until it became almost intoxicating. Unlike the reviled commercial fruitcakes, homemade versions were rich with candied fruits, nuts, and enough alcohol to preserve them for months. Black families began preparation in November, soaking dried fruits in bourbon or rum until they plumped with spirits. The batter was heavy with molasses and dark brown sugar, baked low and slow until a toothpick came out clean, but the cake remained moist. Once cooled, the cake was wrapped in cheesecloth, doused with more bourbon, and stored in tins where it aged into something extraordinary. Slices were cut thin because the flavor was so concentrated, each bite delivering fruit, spice, and warmth. Dark fruitcake was often served with hard sauce or simply enjoyed with coffee. This cake was patience made edible, proof that some pleasures were worth waiting for.
Pinto bean and sausage stew was hearty weeknight fare that stretched a small amount of meat into a meal substantial enough to feed a crowd. The beans were soaked overnight, then simmered with sliced smoked sausage, onions, garlic, and tomatoes until everything became tender. The sausage released its fat into the broth, creating richness that permeated every bite. Some cooks added chili powder or cumin for warmth, while others kept seasoning simple. This stew was often made on Sundays and reheated throughout the week, each serving tasting better than the last. The beans provided protein and fiber, while sausage satisfied cravings for meat without breaking the budget. Children grew up eating this stew over rice, learning that simple ingredients cooked with care could rival anything. Fried catfish appeared on Christmas tables near plantations with rivers, streams, or ponds where enslaved people were sometimes permitted to fish during their limited free time. Catfish lurked in muddy bottoms, feeding on whatever the water provided, and they could be caught with simple lines and hooks made from bent pins or scavenged metal. The fish were cleaned, rolled in cornmeal, seasoned with salt and whatever pepper was available, then fried in hot lard until the coating turned golden and crispy. The flesh inside stayed white and flaky, with a mild sweetness that made catfish a prize catch. Fishing required patience and knowledge, understanding where fish gathered, what time they fed, how to read water and weather. At Christmas, a successful fishing trip meant protein that hadn't come from slaveholder rations, food that represented freedom in small measure. Families gathered to share the fish, dividing portions carefully so everyone received a taste of something special earned through their own skill.
Elderflower cordial brought delicate sweetness and subtle healing to kitchens that often lacked sugar and fruit. When elder shrubs burst into fragrant clusters in early summer, gatherers clipped the blossoms and steeped them in water with a touch of honey or sorghum to create a lightly floral syrup. This cordial could be sipped as a soothing drink, stirred into simple desserts, or used as a gentle remedy for coughs and fevers. The method reflected old-world European customs while blending with African-American herbal practice, showing how cultures met in the shared search for flavor and wellness. Long after emancipation, elderflower cordial remained a quiet luxury in rural households, prized for its refreshing taste during hot southern days. Today, it reappears in cocktails and artisanal sodas, but its roots lie in careful foraging and centuries of folk medicine. Elderflower cordial proves that even in times of want, people found ways to capture the fleeting perfume of summer and preserve it for moments of calm and celebration. Charred sweet cornmeal cakes were the traveler's food, built for endurance, not pleasure. The batter of ground corn, salt, and water was poured thin and cooked until crisp and dark, intentionally over-roasted to make the cakes last longer without spoiling. They were tough, smoky, and dry, but when soaked in broth or water, they softened into hearty meals again. Portable and durable, they could be wrapped in cloth and carried for days. For those who worked long hours away from fire or kitchen, these cakes were essential fuel, simple, sturdy, and reliable. The char was not a flaw but a strategy, sealing in flavor and strength. Each cake told a story of discipline, of people who could not afford to waste a grain. The smell of roasted corn was familiar and grounding, a link between past and present laborers. Each bite was proof of cleverness, born from need, a reminder that even the humblest ingredients could sustain great endurance. These cakes may not have been festive or soft, but they were food that traveled with you through struggle and survival alike, feeding body and will across endless miles of hardship.
Crowder pea stew was a southern specialty that showcased field peas at their creamy, earthy best. The peas were simmered with smoked ham hocks or salt pork until they broke down into a thick, almost gravy-like consistency. The cooking liquid became rich with smoky pork flavor, while the peas themselves turned soft and satisfying. Onions, garlic, and bay leaves added depth without overwhelming the peas' natural taste. Some families added tomatoes or hot peppers, while others preferred the pure simplicity of peas and pork. This stew was summer harvest food originally, made when peas were fresh and abundant, but it worked equally well with dried peas in winter. Served over rice with cornbread on the side, it was a complete meal that cost almost nothing but tasted like abundance. Cornmeal mush with molasses was breakfast, dinner, and sometimes supper, a dish so basic it barely qualified as cooking, yet sustained millions. Cornmeal was the foundation of the enslaved diet, distributed weekly by slaveholders who considered it adequate sustenance. Mixed with water and cooked until thick, the mush was bland and filling, its texture somewhere between porridge and paste. Molasses transformed it, adding sweetness and flavor that made mush worth eating rather than merely endurable. At Christmas, there might be extra molasses, enough to make mush taste almost like dessert. Children learned to stir slowly, preventing lumps while it thickened over fire. Adults ate, knowing this simple food was keeping them alive another day. The dish represented the minimum of nutrition, corn and sugar, calories without joy, yet enslaved families found ways to make even this humble fare feel worth gathering around together.
Ground kudzu root paste emerged when conventional flours were scarce and starchy substitutes were needed to thicken stews or stretch breads. Kudzu, an invasive vine introduced from Asia, sent deep roots into the southern soil that stored abundant starch. Enslaved gatherers dug these roots, washed and dried them, then pounded them into a fine powder. Mixed with water, the powder formed a paste that thickened soups or acted as a binder for cornmeal cakes. Its mild flavor and reliable texture made it a quiet but important ingredient in times of scarcity. After emancipation, some rural families continued to harvest kudzu for its starch, and today herbalists still value it for its medicinal qualities. Ground kudzu root paste shows how knowledge of local plants and persistence in foraging allowed cooks to replace costly ingredients with what the land freely offered, turning an aggressive vine into a vital pantry staple, and demonstrating again how necessity inspired both culinary creativity and a deeper understanding of the southern landscape's hidden gifts. Sorrel leaf steep was a burst of red tang in a world that often offered little color or comfort. Made from dried hibiscus-like leaves, the steep was both drink and medicine, refreshing in heat, cleansing in illness, and joyful in spirit. It came from deep roots in West Africa, where the drink was known as bisap, and it crossed the ocean in memory long before it ever reached American soil. Boiled with ginger or orange peel when available, it turned water into something sacred, bright, and alive. For enslaved people, it was a rare taste of home, a sip that tied them to ancestors and land across the sea. It was tart, strong, and deeply red, the color of endurance itself. Even when made from wild sorrel instead of imported hibiscus, the essence remained the same, a reminder that flavor and identity could not be stripped away, only adapted.
Neck bone stew carried families through the coldest months when money was tight and bellies needed filling. Pork neck bones were cheap at the butcher counter, often sold for pennies a pound because most people overlooked them. But black cooks knew better. They understood these bony cuts held deep flavor, waiting to be coaxed out through gentle simmering. The bones were browned first, then covered with water and left to bubble alongside potatoes, carrots, onions, and celery until the meat became fork tender. Some families added turnips or cabbage to stretch things further. The smell alone announced dinner was ready, drifting through every room like a warm invitation. Children hovered near the stove, waiting to tear meat from bones with their fingers. This stew proved the humblest ingredients could become something worth gathering around. Okra soup was a Christmas dish connecting enslaved people directly to West African foodways where okra had been cultivated and cooked for centuries before the Middle Passage. The vegetable grew well in southern heat and was dried for winter use, the pods strung on thread and hung from cabin rafters. Reconstituted in water, the okra released its characteristic thick, silky texture that gave body to soups and stews. Combined with whatever meat or fish was available, onions and pepper, the soup became warming sustenance on cold December nights. The distinctive texture, slippery and substantial, was beloved by those who grew up with it and sometimes strange to others. At Christmas, okra soup might be richer than usual, made with more meat or served in larger portions. The dish represented cultural continuity, proof that African cooking traditions survived despite slavery's attempts to erase identity. Each bowl was an act of remembrance and resistance.
Smoked frog legs provided unexpected protein from the marshes and bayous surrounding many southern plantations. Skilled foragers caught frogs at night with simple nets or by hand, cleaning the meaty hind legs and seasoning them with salt and wild herbs before smoking them slowly over hickory coals. The gentle smoke preserved the meat for days and gave it a rich, savory flavor that paired well with cornbread or greens. This practice echoed West African traditions of smoking small game and fish to ensure longevity in hot climates. After emancipation, smoked frog legs remained a regional delicacy in Louisiana and coastal communities, later becoming a celebrated dish in Cajun cuisine. They remind us that survival often required deep familiarity with the waterways and a willingness to turn overlooked resources into sustaining meals. Smoked frog legs stand as an example of how necessity and skill created flavors that outlasted hardship, transforming what began as a pragmatic hunt into a distinctive part of Southern culinary heritage and a taste still enjoyed today. Roasted acorn mash was one of the earliest lessons in transformation, how something bitter could be made good. Acorns gathered from the forest floor were soaked for days to wash away their harsh tannins, then ground, roasted, and stirred into porridge or cakes. The work was slow, but the result was nourishing, dense, and filling enough to last through the hardest labor. It carried the deep, nutty scent of the woods and a flavor unlike anything from a store shelf today. Making acorn mash required patience and knowledge passed down through generations, blending African technique with native wisdom. It was survival as craft, every step deliberate, every bite earned. For those who lived on the edge of hunger, this humble meal was both shield and strength. It proved that what others overlooked could become a feast in the right hands. Syllabub was the elegant Christmas drink dessert that African American families served in their finest glasses when company came calling during the holidays. This frothy mixture of cream, sugar, wine or sherry, and lemon juice was whipped until it held soft peaks, then spooned into cups where it slowly separated into cream on top and sweet liquid below. The name sounded fancy and the presentation impressed, but the recipe was simple enough for any cook to master. Black families learned syllabub from plantation kitchens and made it their own, sometimes substituting homemade wine or adding nutmeg for warmth. Guests would eat the cream with spoons, then drink the sweet wine that pooled beneath. 2 desserts in one. Syllabub required no baking, no special equipment, just good cream and patience with the whipping. It represented the kind of old-fashioned elegance that Christmas once demanded. A reminder that celebration meant elevating everyday ingredients into something worth savoring slowly. Wild rice pudding combined indigenous grains with African-inspired preparation to create a dish both nourishing and subtly sweet. Wild rice grew naturally in shallow lakes and slow rivers, and enslaved families near these wetlands harvested the dark grains with paddles and baskets, drying them in the sun for year-round use. Cooked slowly in water until tender, the rice was stirred with a bit of sorghum syrup or honey if available, making a warm pudding that supplied protein and lasting energy. Its nutty flavor and satisfying texture turned a simple bowl into a special treat, especially when fresh fruit or spices could be added. This recipe carried forward after emancipation as African American cooks continued to value wild rice for festive meals and family gatherings. Modern chefs still celebrate its earthy richness, but the story behind wild rice pudding honors the blend of native and African foodways that sustained people through scarcity and created a dessert that is at once humble and deeply rooted in the shared history of America's wetlands and kitchens. Crushed oyster shell lime was survival ingenuity disguised as chemistry. Oysters, abundant along the southern coast, provided more than food. Their shells were burned or ground to make lime, which could be used to cure meats, preserve vegetables, or supplement diets lacking calcium. The process was slow and smoky. Shells collected, crushed, and heated until they turned white and brittle. The powder that remained was mixed into brine or rubbed onto food before storage. It could even be used to whiten walls or patch small cracks in chimneys, turning waste into utility in every sense. For those denied access to medical care or proper nutrition, this humble material offered health and preservation alike. The smell of burning shells lingered in the air, marking the intersection of hardship and invention. It was the science of necessity, born not in laboratories but in the open air by those who learned to read nature's laws through need. Even waste became resource. The oyster shell stood as a small testament to wisdom gathered from both land and sea, proof that nothing in survival was ever truly thrown away, and that even what was discarded could build the foundation of endurance. Ambrosia was the fruit salad that African American families served at Christmas when fresh fruit was a rare and precious luxury in the winter South. This wasn't the heavy, mayonnaise-laden version that came later. Traditional ambrosia was simply fresh oranges, shredded coconut, and perhaps a sprinkle of sugar, layered in glass bowls that showed off its beauty. Black families would wait for Christmas oranges to arrive, peeling them carefully and removing every bit of white pith. Fresh coconut was grated by hand, the white shreds mixing with the bright citrus like snowflakes on sunshine. Some added maraschino cherries for color or pineapple for sweetness, but purists insisted on keeping it simple. Ambrosia was served cold, often in the family's best crystal bowl, positioned among the heavier desserts. The name meant food of the gods, and for families who rarely saw fresh fruit in December, it truly was divine. Ambrosia was celebration in a bowl, a reminder that the freshest ingredients needed nothing more than each other. Dried pumpkin ropes were a symbol of patience and practicality, a way to stretch one harvest into many months of meals. Strips of pumpkin flesh were cut thin with worn knives and hung near the fire to dry, curling into long ropes that hardened in the smoke and heat. These strands could be stored for months, waiting to be dropped into stews to thicken broth or soften into porridge. Pumpkin was plentiful after harvest, but fresh produce never lasted long, especially under the strain of forced labor and limited access to land. Drying it was the answer, transforming something fleeting into something enduring. The faint sweetness of rehydrated pumpkin added depth to meals made mostly from grains or roots. The ropes hung from rafters like garlands of survival, bright orange reminders that foresight and resourcefulness were as valuable as any spice. It was food that carried memory and the quiet discipline of those who refused to starve. Bread pudding with hard sauce was the Christmas dessert that turned African-American thrift into pure indulgence. Stale bread that might have gone to waste was cubed, soaked in a custard of eggs, milk, sugar, and vanilla, then baked until the top turned golden and crispy while the center stayed soft. The real magic came from the hard sauce, a simple mixture of butter, powdered sugar, and bourbon, beaten until fluffy and served cold atop the warm pudding. As the sauce hit the hot bread pudding, it melted into rivers of boozy sweetness that pooled in every crevice. Families saved bread for weeks before Christmas, knowing that the drier the bread, the better it would absorb the custard. Raisins, pecans, and cinnamon were common additions, each household adjusting to their taste. Bread pudding with hard sauce was waste-nothing wisdom transformed into holiday luxury, proof that resourcefulness and celebration were never in conflict. Sun-cured crawfish tails were a marshland treasure, preserved through sunlight and time. Inland from the coast, those who lived near swamps trapped small crawfish in baskets or woven nets, cooking them over low flames before removing the meat. The tails were spread out on wooden boards and dried in the sun until leathery, ready to last for months. Once rehydrated, they flavored soups, rice, or cornmeal porridge with the taste of the bayou. Each batch was an act of careful labor, salting, drying, guarding from insects, and each handful stored away meant another meal secured. The air around the drying rack smelled faintly of salt and smoke, and the rhythm of turning the tails became almost ritual. This food was both preservation and preparation, a promise against hunger's return. For people who could not rely on markets or steady provisions, this practice was independence made edible. Like fish jerky, it carried both salt and strength, a trace of the water that gave it life. Every preserved crawfish tail was a memory of resourcefulness, a morsel of the marsh turned into endurance, a symbol of self-reliance drawn straight from the earth's edge. Buttermilk pie was the tangy Christmas custard that African-American families made when eggs and dairy were plentiful, but fruit was scarce. The filling combined buttermilk with eggs, sugar, butter, and a whisper of vanilla and nutmeg, creating a custard that was simultaneously rich and refreshing. The buttermilk's natural acidity cut through the sweetness, making this pie surprisingly easy to eat slice after slice. Black families valued this recipe because buttermilk was a byproduct of buttermaking, essentially free for those who churned their own. The pie baked until the top developed a golden brown skin that contrasted beautifully with the creamy white interior. Some families added lemon zest for brightness, while others preferred the pure buttermilk flavor. The pie was served chilled, making it a welcome contrast to warm holiday cakes and heavy puddings. Buttermilk pie represented the ingenuity of using what you had, transforming a humble dairy product into something genuinely elegant. It was thrift disguised as indulgence. Which dish carries your family's history? Drop it in the comments, hit like, and subscribe so we can keep honoring the resilience and genius that turned survival into soul food.